Chapter 1257. Berlin faintly glanced at the elders of the major forces after he entered the arena. He found a place to stand. The elders of the other forces moved away from him. Although they knew that the corpse kings wouldn't cause trouble during the coronation ceremony, they didn't want to get too close to them. The ceremony was about to begin as the leaders of the major forces entered the arena. In the imperial palace, Barton, Sergei, and the others stood in the main hall and looked at the figure on the throne with excitement. Although they knew that this day would come, when it really happened, they were still excited by the lively atmosphere around them. Who would have thought that the humble figure who came from an orphanage would climb to the position he had today, overlooking all the heroes of the world and covering the sky with one hand? Noyce silently bowed his head in front of the crowd. There was a trace of bitterness in his mouth. "It would be good if you were here." Dean looked out of the hall. There was a bit of nostalgia and regret in his eyes. He took a deep breath and slowly got up. There was a kind of momentum of a king descending to the world. He got down from the throne and walked down the stairs step by step. With every step he took, he couldn't help but think of the lowly figure who had struggled in Sylvia's arms. The figure was imprisoned in the cell. He stretched out his hand towards the sky but couldn't grasp the freedom. The figure could only bow his head in the face of the contempt of the nobles. The figure was alone in the abyss. He was like a frightened bird in the face of a powerful monster. Those figures quickly flashed through his mind. They seemed to be struggling to climb up the stairs that he had walked down. But God had extinguished any hope and left no door open. It seemed that the figures in his mind were struggling to climb up the stairs. They overlapped with each other as he walked down the stairs. Once humble, now glorious, in the future, after all the hard work, he was finally crowned as the king. The corner of his mouth slowly curled up. It was cold, but it was unruly and presumptuous. His gaze was disdainful, and his indifferent eyes slowly burned with a raging flame that could devour the world. This raging flame was even hotter and more scorching than the sun above his head. Therefore, even though he had stepped out of the palace, his eyes were still bright and sparkling under the boundless sunlight of the clear blue sky. Rumble! A giant beast was dragged over from outside the square. It was a marine monster. The fins and scales on its body were characteristics of marine monsters. Although it had sharp claws, it wasn't suitable for crawling. Its giant tail was like a shark, but it was as sharp as a knife. The people in the middle of the square quickly made way for it as they stared at the gigantic sea monster in shock. Their eyesight was incomparable to that of ordinary people, and they could tell at a glance that this gigantic beast was extremely powerful. It was probably a king-level overlord of the sea. It was just that a sea monster of this level had actually been captured in a half-dead state. It was more difficult to catch a king-level monster than to hunt a mutant plant. Even 7 or 8 kings might not be able to do it. Dean slowly stepped on the high altar. When his figure appeared on the altar in the square, the slightly chaotic sound instantly quieted down. Everyone looked up at the slightly dazzling sunlight. They only felt that his whole body seemed to be shrouded in darkness. It was difficult to see his face, but his whole body revealed a strange feeling that made people feel terrified. "Today, I declare that the world will be united." Dean slowly opened his mouth. His voice was clear but spread throughout the audience. Everyone was shocked. They knew that the moment had finally come. The Federation, the Empire, and the Fire Dragon Country had been at war for 200 or 300 years. None of them could do anything to each other. Who would have thought that such a situation would appear? But the facts were in front of them. "Dragon, whale, shark, sacrifice to the heavens," Dean indifferently said. Everyone knew that the sea monster was called Dragon Whale Shark. They couldn't help but look at it. When the Dragon Whale Shark was dragged off the stage, Barton, who was standing behind Barton, handed over the sword he had prepared beforehand. Dean didn't take it. He slowly raised his hand, and his arm suddenly extended, turning into a giant sword that was hundreds of meters long. It seemed to be a black pillar that was erected from the square to the sky, but the outline of the blade was extremely clear. At the moment when everyone was shocked and trembling, the blade suddenly fell, and with a bang, it cut into the body of the dragon whale shark, cutting it into two halves. The sacrifice to the heavens is complete. We welcome the new emperor to the throne. The duke who was in charge of the dynasty's etiquette system took the lead and knelt down. Aurora, Sergei, Noyce and others knelt down one after another. Then, on the plaza in front of the altar, the leaders of the various forces, the kings, the abyss, and the top-tier mecha operators all knelt down one after another. They bent their backs like a gust of wind blowing through a paddy field. At this moment, the entire giant wall kingdom of Sylvia, as well as the relatives and children who accompanied the important people outside the city, heard the bell ringing from the direction of the giant wall kingdom. All of them knelt down in awe. Even if some of them didn't understand what was going on, but when they saw other people around them kneeling down in salute, they were scared and quickly knelt down. Dean looked in front of him. He was the only one standing in the sky. This was the power of the king, supreme and unique. He didn't know why, but there wasn't much excitement in his heart. Instead, he was disappointed. Being above hundreds of millions of people is only to find some comfort in a painful life. It's just like a poor man who picked up a little money and was overjoyed, temporarily forgetting his hardship. However, this joy will eventually fade, and happiness will always pass quickly. However, the pain will last for a long time. Doesn't this mean that we are born and live to suffer? Dean sighed and left the altar. The rest of the tedious etiquette was handed over to the people below. The ceremony was bustling. The streets of Sylvia were brightly lit day and night. The excitement lasted for 3 days before it gradually faded away. The rest of the people were living their lives step by step. The leaders of the major forces left the capital the next day and returned to their respective posts. Now that the world was united, all the forces were adjusting and contacting with each other. There were many things to do. Dean sorted out for a few days. After setting a general framework, he handed over the specific trivial matters to his parent. Originally, he wanted to ask Noyce to supervise it, but Noyce resigned after the coronation ceremony. He wanted to be in charge of a wall and be a carefree wall lord. His persuasion was fruitless, so he could only agree. The forces of the major forces were rapidly merging. The tectonic plates of the entire continent were changing. Monsters in the abyss were being hunted. Traces of adventurer teams could be seen in the wilderness. Chapter 1258. The once inaccessible abyss had now been reduced to a wasteland area, cleaned up by adventurers and imperial legions. Land monsters were hunted and slaughtered in large numbers, and their numbers were sharply reduced. The hunters of the Empire were equipped with the sophisticated detection equipment of the Federation and popularized the fighting techniques that the Fire Dragon Nation was good at. Their overall strength was greatly improved, and there was a frenzy of monster hunting in a short period of time. A few short months passed. Most of the wilderness areas within the borders of the Empire had been cleaned up, and the soldiers of the Empire were stationed in fortresses. Some areas near the fortresses where forests and swamps intersected were also busy preparing for the construction of wilderness supply market. Everyone could feel that a glorious and grand era was coming. The merger of the 3 major forces brought about rapid development with each passing day. Many social experts of the old Federation predicted that in the next 3 years, human footprints would be spread all over the continent. The wilderness outside the giant wall would no longer be a forbidden area that everyone was afraid of, and the land monsters would eventually be extinct. Some experts even joked that monsters might be included in the animal protection laws in the future world. When the continent was being opened up on a large scale, the high-yield hunting of monsters had brought about vigorous development in all levels of fields, especially the tourism industry. The leading groups had already smelled the business opportunities in the changing world structure in the future, and were preparing resources to build tourism channels in the developed wilderness for the young masters of aristocrats and rich businessmen to play. In the future, different areas would be divided into different levels of tourist attractions. The scientific research experts of the old Federation and the various alchemists of the Empire had merged, and their knowledge connected and complemented each other. Just like the combination of medicine in the early days of the old era, they competed with each other and argued endlessly, bringing about a chemical reaction that rapidly improved the overall level of the industry. After a certain period of time, they would integrate and accept each other, and once again erupt into a higher level of improvement. Many special monsters were tested to have non-toxic flesh and blood, and could be eaten. They were sent to the dining tables of the aristocrats. Many special plants and herbs were tested to have magical medical effects that were even more powerful than penicillin in the old era, and brought great help to human medical institutions. The entire empire was changing rapidly and becoming more and more beautiful. Everyone could look forward to an exciting future. His eyes moved slightly as he muttered to himself, "Her god's body is enough to adapt to the environment of the universe. Fighting in the universe is no different from fighting on Earth. It shouldn't be a problem for her to stop the origami." He was relieved to let the goddess of Wa go alone. Apart from the fact that he was a quasi-god, it would be difficult for him to exert much combat power in space. The more important reason was that the goddess of Wa's strength was many times stronger than when she first woke up. She could even eat the origami spaceship that was left on Earth. The indestructible special metal was like a piece of paper in front of her. Chapter 1259. Dean thought that Goddess Wa would be fine, but he still went to another secret hall in the palace. He used a communicator from the demonic insect's spaceship to contact the moon. He asked the demonic insect to switch the scene of the battle in outer space. Very soon, he saw a brilliant explosion of light. Battleships were destroyed one after another. A huge and ferocious interstellar creature was lying in front of the battleships. It looked like a giant octopus that lived in deep space, but the front end of its tentacles were long, curved, and black sharp blades. It swept around randomly, cutting the fighter jets that flew out from the battleships into pieces. The flames of the explosions were as weak as waves in the silent space. Dean was relieved to see the ferocious giant beast. Although the giant beast didn't have the shadow of Goddess Wa in her human form, but he could recognize that it was Goddess Wa. Perhaps this was the unique special feeling between them. The battle that followed was just as he had expected. The origami battleships that were charging towards them were all destroyed by the Goddess Wa. One after another, the origami charged out of the battleships and fought against the Goddess Wa. However, they were either eaten by the Goddess Wa or slapped to death. They were no match for her. Goddess Wa became stronger and stronger as she fought. The potential in her body was constantly stimulated. In the end, she turned into a blade that was thousands of meters long and slashed at the origami battleship like a long sword. The origami battleship was cut in half. There should be no life in the world, no, in the entire universe that could resist such power. Dean looked at the fierce battle on the screen. There was a glimmer of light in his eyes. Fire Dragon Country. This name had become ancient, and no one would mention it again. However, the landscape hadn't changed much. There were many figures dressed in strange clothes on the street. Some of them were from the Federation, some were from the Empire. Most of them were merchants who came to trade. In the early days of the new era, they were adventuring to make a fortune. In the former king's city, the Chilan king stepped out of the palace and looked at the city in front of him. There were countless buildings and people living in them. They used to be his people. Presently, he wasn't a king any longer, and he'd submitted to the new emperor. Moreover, under the emperor's reward, he was conferred the position of Minister of the Border, and he still controlled Fire Dragon Country. However, he was managing the world for someone else now, and he wasn't managing his own world. Moreover, he knew that all of this was temporary. Once the three great forces completely reconciled with each other, the great emperor would definitely have the time to kill him. He let out a light breath, and a faint smile appeared on his chiseled face. He leaped up and flew away, leaving the palace, and also away from the many eyes in the palace. He flew above King City and gradually rose higher. The clouds shrouded his figure, and when he shook off all the gazes, his figure suddenly swayed and changed into another appearance. His aura also changed completely. After all, he was a demigod who had surpassed the king realm, so he had more abilities than the king realm. Soon, he descended into the clouds and snuck into a hidden underground area in the wilderness outside King City. There was a spaceship hidden deep underground. This spaceship was isolated from all external senses and had the ability to turn invisible. When he arrived, the door of the spaceship opened automatically. He went straight in and walked along the blood-red passageway in the spaceship. It was as if he was passing through the intestines of a gigantic magical creature. Soon, he arrived at a spacious area that looked like a conference room. There were 8 figures standing here, and all of them looked like earthlings. There were men and women, young and old, but at this moment, all of them were expressionless. The contours of their cheeks were hidden in the shadows, and their eyes were dull as if they were dead. When Qilin Lord arrived, a squeaking sound suddenly came from the top of one of the girls' head. A red soft thing that looked like a snake and an intestine drilled out from the top of her head and occupied her head, making squeaking sound. This was the language of the flaming devil bug. You're finally here. Quickly take a look at this. Qilin Lord's expression was solemn. In the middle of the 8 people was a huge metal platform. As the flaming devil bug finished speaking, a virtual projection floated on the platform, and the content of the projection was a video of an intense battle in space. This is that god? Qilin Lord's gaze froze. That's right, it's that damned god controlled by the Earthlings. A flaming devil bug also crawled out from the top of another handsome young man's head. Its body coiled around his neck, and it made a strange hissing sound. Other than God, there's also that group of stupid origami. These damned guys seemed to be preparing to attack Earth, but they were stopped by this god. Attack Earth? Qilin Lord frowned and snorted coldly. Haven't they given up yet? Their old nest has already changed owners, and they still want to make a comeback? Even if they come to Earth, they'll still be delivering food. No, they want to destroy Earth, 'cause a star explosion, and destroy the Earthlings, that god, and all of us. That's right. If that's the case, only they are left with the secret of becoming a god. Moreover, they have already created a demigod, and he's only one step away from becoming a god. That demigod's lifespan is enough to survive for 10,000 years, which is enough to support them to wander in the universe, find new planets with life, and continue to complete their experiments, the 2 flaming devil bugs said while squeaking. Qilin Lord's expression changed. He didn't expect the origami to be so vicious, but after thinking about it, he felt that this was the smartest move. He felt a chill in his heart, and when he saw the scene of the fleet being destroyed on the screen, he secretly rejoiced. He didn't expect that he would accidentally die just like that. God has already stopped their conspiracy. Now, the Demon Emperor is probably the only one left in the origami race. He will probably leave this planet and wander in the universe alone, looking for a new intelligent planet. After all, it's meaningless to continue staying here, and there's also the danger of being exposed. No one knows how far this god will continue to grow. Once he truly becomes a complete god, he will be omnipotent and omniscient. It will be easy for him to find the Demon Emperor and us. Fortunately, the god is controlled by that despicable human and didn't absorb a large amount of nutrient. Now, he's just a baby, or else we would have to move immediately. Qilin Lord was startled, and he said respectfully, from what the few sages said, does it mean that we still have hope for now, and we don't need to move? That's right, there's still a glimmer of hope. One of the flaming devil bugs sneered. Qilin Lord's eyes lit up and he said, "Lord, what do you mean? God is invincible, but it's a pity that this God has been controlled by a human. From a perfect God, he became a flawed God. Therefore, this God isn't complete, and he isn't even a true God. Because of this God isn't undying. The method to kill the God lies in that human. He's the only flaw of this God." Qilin Lord was startled. "Not a true God? Lord Sage means that we should use that human to kill the God? But that human is already a quasi-deity, and he's much stronger than me. I'm not his opponent at all." "Humph, what quasi-deity?" "He's just borrowing the power of the Sage's engine of those idiots. We'll implant the same Sage's engine into your body, and your power won't be inferior to his." Qilin Lord smiled bitterly. "But even so, he has the help of a God, and I'm not his opponent. Relax, we're not saying this to let you deal with him. We naturally have someone here who can deal with him. Moreover, this person is someone that even God won't harm. He's an invincible person." "Invincible person?" Qilin Lord was astonished. "That's right. But this person hasn't matured yet, and he still needs to be strengthened. We need to borrow your power and your half-god body," another flaming devil insect said in a deep voice. Qilin Lord's heart trembled, but he remained calm and collected. "Lord Sages, what do you mean?" "For the eternal life of our race, for the endless reproduction of our race, we can only inconvenience you. Are you willing to sacrifice yourself?" Hearing this, Qilin Lord's expression changed and became incomparably unsightly. After a moment, he took a deep breath and said, "Since Lord Sages have already planned it out, I'm naturally willing. Then I'll inconvenience you. It's fine." Just as Qilin Lord finished speaking, he suddenly attacked. His expression became incomparably sinister. "Only I'm alive. Whether you guys live or die has nothing to do with me. What meaning is there to me? All of you die." "What a pity," the other flaming devil insect sighed. Chapter 1260. Whoosh! A slender figure descended from the sky and flew back to the palace. Dean quietly waited in the study room of the palace. He sensed Goddess Wa's aura as she entered the room. She had reverted to the appearance of a human girl. She didn't look like the ferocious body she had when she fought against the origami in the universe. "Are you okay?" Dean asked softly. The tiredness in Goddess Wa's eyes faded a little. She grinned, which seemed to brighten up the whole world. "It's okay. They can't do anything to me yet. I've already killed all of them in space. None of them survived." "I saw it." Dadian nodded and glanced at her. "Thanks to you, otherwise the entire Earth would have been destroyed. You should be regarded as the savior of all humans and life on Earth. You are a great hero." Goddess Wa smiled as she stared at him. "I don't want to be a savior or a hero. I just want to be with my mother. Now that the origami has been eliminated and the world is at peace, we will be together in the future." Dean smiled. Goddess Wa nodded. "I'll find a way to strengthen the detection system of the moon so that the flaming magic insects won't use the same method to invade and destroy the Earth." "Good." Dean looked at her with approval. Goddess Wa wasn't only extraordinary in terms of fighting power. She wasn't inferior to ordinary people in terms of wisdom. However, she was bound by emotions and was willing to follow him. If she was free from his shackles, then she would grow to a horrifying level in a short period of time. Dean's heart calmed down after Goddess Wa left. He continued to immerse himself in the undead experiment. Time flew by. The new and old forces of the dynasty had undergone earth-shaking changes, while Dadian was immersed in the laboratory. Barton, Sergei, Aurora and the others were the leaders. They divided up a large number of troops, territories and slaughtered many of the old aristocrats. The forces of these old aristocrats were entangled and rooted in all classes. They had been corrupted for a long time. Aurora and others were like hungry newborn tigers. They crazily devoured the territory and wealth of the old aristocrats to strengthen themselves and become the new rising families of the dynasty. Apart from the changes in the power structure within the dynasty, the effects of the merger of the three major factions were also gradually becoming apparent. Interconnected trade brought about rapid development. Railroad tracks were laid all over the wilderness. Now there was no such thing as the chaos abyss. Everything was collectively referred to as the adventure zones. In addition to the giant wall, people built a large number of fortresses and new cities in the wilderness. These fortresses and cities had walls that were less than 100 meters high and occupied a wide area of the ground. They were like flags inserted all over the earth. From this trend, it could be foreseen that in the future, the monsters on this continent could only retreat to the wilderness at the extreme border. Humans would once again display their innate aggressiveness, taking the continent into their pocket. The monsters would once again be reduced to beasts from the olden era, repelled by human civilization and cities. While the continents were being cleaned up, Aurora, Barton, and the others turned their attention to the overseas world. The eruption of nuclear bombs in the olden era caused the continental plates to move. Today's continents belonged to the Asian region, but at the same time they were combined with the surrounding islands. These islands were pushed by the nuclear bombs and the sea monsters, colliding with the continents and combining them together. On the other side of the distant sea, there were still other fragmented continents and islands, but their area was far less than the main continent. When Barton, Aurora, and the others proposed to Dean to conquer the overseas and sea monsters, Dean didn't think much and agreed. He knew about the overseas continent from the hidden information of the Federation and the Imperial capital. He also knew that there were human survivors on those continents, but these survivors weren't disturbed by the insects and origami. They belonged to the abandoned human race, and their development was a continuation of the real trajectory after the human disaster. Without any external help, they completely relied on the old civilization to struggle and survive in the doomsday. Their fighting was still at the level of relying on firearms to fight, and they hadn't started to evolve. With the strength of Aurora and the others, they could casually lead an army to flatten the continent. Therefore, he didn't pay attention to them. As for the sea monsters, they really needed to be cleaned up. Since Aurora and the others volunteered, he was happy to let them exercise. With Dean's permission, the era of expeditions began. Aurora, Barton, Sergei, and the others led the army to repair the ships and capture the overseas continent. They also began to suppress the sea monsters. From the recent areas, they began to hunt ferociously. When the sea demons were hunted down in large numbers, the corpses of the demons would be transported to the Empire, where scientists from other fields would combine the technology of the origami and the demons to study the corpses. From there, they would find many valuable materials that would be of great help to the medical field. They would also create some new hunting weapons, which would increase the value of the sea demons and attract more hunters, forming a virtuous cycle. As the number of land monsters gradually decreased, the hunters could only lock their eyes on the sea monsters. Sergei, Aurora, and the others raised the flag of the dynasty to conquer the coastal areas. Many free groups of hunters followed them to pick up the leftovers. A new era of sea hunting had begun. In the blink of an eye, 1 year and 3 months passed. Dean took off his fish-skin gloves and left the Undead Research Institute. He seemed to be in a good mood. Today's research went smoothly. From the gallbladder of a shallow sea giant monster, he found a stimulating cell. From the preliminary experiment, it had a good reaction to the undead, which was very rare. Your Majesty, this is a letter from Noyce. Sergei came to the study room and found Dean resting inside. Dean looked at the letter in Sergei's hand. He used his X-ray vision to scan the contents. Isn't he in the giant wall? Is there no network there? Sergei laughed as he saw that Dean was in a good mood. Your Majesty, you know that he isn't used to that thing. He likes handwritten letters. Dean nodded. I've read the letter. Tell him that he doesn't need to report to me if he needs any resources. I know. Sergei smiled as he was ready to leave. Dean suddenly thought of another thing. Tell the Qilin king to come and see me. I have something to discuss with him. Sergei's eyes lit up. Your Majesty, what are you doing? Dean indifferently said. Now that the three forces have mixed and the bottom level has adapted to it, he should retire. Sergei thought for a moment. Your Majesty, you didn't specifically summon him. Wouldn't it make him suspicious if you call him over? Do you want me and Aurora to personally go and bring him over? All right. Dean thought for a moment. Since you want to go, then the 4 kings and 12 kings should go together. But make the others hide their identity so as not to alert the enemy. Dudian whispered. The fear on the Qilin lord's face slowly receded and faded. His expression became indifferent. He raised his head and looked at Dean, who was sitting on the throne. Your Majesty, if you want to incriminate someone, you can always find a pretext. Now the world is at peace. If you want to get rid of me, just say it. Why do you have to find a high-sounding reason for yourself? You Earthlings are ridiculous. Because the history of Earthlings tells us that we can save some trouble if we have a good reason. Dean indifferently said, Since you have confessed, I will give you 2 choices. The first is to confess everything about the flaming magic insect. I have destroyed the ice magic insects on the moon. I don't believe that the flaming magic insects would be willing to give up the opportunity to become a god. The second? The Qilin lord indifferently said. Die. Dean only said one word. The Qilin lord didn't seem surprised. He sighed. If that's the case, then I can only choose the first one. There was a bit of helplessness in his voice. It seemed that he had already accepted his fate. But when his voice fell, his body suddenly disappeared. Like a phantom, he suddenly pounced in front of Dean. His whole body was burning with raging flames. It was hot like a ball of fire. Dean looked at the ferocious face that was approaching in an instant. His expression was as usual. He was also not surprised. He indifferently said, Is this the reason why you followed them? As he spoke, there were already hundreds and thousands of black blades erected on his body. They were thin and sharp, slashing out like a hurricane. Explode! The Qilin lord roared. Boom! The flames on his body suddenly shrank and collapsed. Like a blazing fireball, he suddenly exploded. The destructive aftermath swept the entire hall, melting the gold throne into golden liquid. It could be seen that the temperature reached at least 1,000 degrees Celsius in that instant. Not waiting for the explosion to subside, several black blades suddenly slashed out from the blazing explosion. The sharp blades were accompanied by dark energy. It was a kind of magic mark ability unique to 4-star legendary monsters, dark annihilation energy. The sharp blades swept out and quickly cut out the strong flames. They slashed out thousands of times in a second. Huh! Dean, who was wearing a black horny scale armor behind the sharp blades, looked at the Qilin lord in the flames. He raised his eyebrows. You also have the Sage engine embedded? Is this the reason why you dare to come and assassinate me? Go to hell! The response was the Qilin lord's roar. His beard and hair were standing up, and his face was full of anger. However, there was a bit of horror in his eyes. He didn't expect that the move he had been brewing for a long time would be easily resolved by Dean. He once again erupted with more blazing energy, simulating the atomic movement of nuclear fusion. I can see through those gambling games at a glance, and I'm not addicted at all. As for those entertainment novels and movies, I can figure out the general narrative structure and core ideas after watching a few of them. I can even write my own. Only battles are the most interesting. There are endless changes, and different enemies will always have different novel ways. Dean touched his forehead and smiled, but fighting is also the most dangerous. Mom, didn't you say that I'm a god? There shouldn't be anything in this world that can hurt me. If you need, I can help you kill all the sea beasts. Goddess Wa smiled cunningly, showing her two small canine teeth. Dean shook his head. You can't kill all the sea beasts. You have to keep them alive. Can't kill all the sea beasts? Then why did Uncle Sergei and the others go to hunt sea beasts? Goddess of Wa was puzzled. Dean waved to her. He reached out and touched her head. What should those powerful hunters do all day if we kill all the sea beasts? They can't go home to embroider. We have to give them something to do. Goddess Wa was suddenly enlightened. She seemed to have understood and said, So you don't want me to hunt the sea beasts because you want to leave them to them. You are afraid that the earth is too harmonious and they will fight among themselves, right? I see. Good girl. Dean smiled. Goddess Wa then asked curiously, Mother, if you're worried that some people would be too bored to fight each other now that peace has been restored to the earth, why don't you find a bigger goal for them? For example, conquering the starry universe above our head. The universe is so vast. There must be other lives other than the origami and the demonic bug. Dean lowered his head and sighed. Conquering the starry sky is a step that we will take sooner or later. But right now we have to find a way to solve the problem of the undeads. Oh, I know. Mom wants to resurrect Miss Aisha safely on Earth. Then we will go to the starry sky with her. Is that right? Goddess of Wa laughed. Dean tapped her head. You are smart. Goddess of Wa stuck out her tongue. I'll go first if there is nothing else. If you are bored, then you can go and hunt a few sea beasts. But pay attention to protect the environment. Don't damage it too much, Dean said. Goddess of Wa's eyes lit up. I don't know how Uncle Sergei and the others will feel when they hear Mom's words. Dean chuckled and drove her away. The era of sea hunting was still hot. A large number of border cities were built in coastal areas. Every day there were groups of adventurers coming from inland. They took giant ships and sailed to the sea to hunt monsters. Humanity's focus shifted from the land to the sea. Related news would often appear, such as a certain big shot hunting a top-tier sea monster, or a certain research institute extracting useful life essence from a sea monster, which would further contribute to the medical industry. People gradually adapted to this era. They used to curl up inside the giant wall after the disaster. They were afraid of the outside world. Now they were sightseeing on the land. Even the unfathomable sea didn't bring fear to people. Instead, they were full of yearning for adventure. Under Dean's order, the dynasty quickly established a religion. It was the state religion to spread the faith. The Holy Church was backed by the imperial order. They further controlled the people's thoughts and made it easier to manage. As the dynasty gradually stabilized, Dean gradually let go of the power and handed it over to his parents and sister. He devoted himself to the experiment day after day. 10 years passed in the blink of an eye. Dean, who used to be 24 or 25 years old, was now a middle-aged man. Immersed in the laboratory all year round, he neglected to dress up. From a handsome young man, he had become a middle-aged man with stubble on his face. His ice-sculpted face became colder and colder, and the power accumulated between his eyebrows was thicker. The immaturity and vigor of his body had completely receded, leaving only calmness, restraint, and calmness. Chapter 1263. It was the rainy season. The sky covered in nuclear dust was gray and drizzling. Apart from the powerful abyssal walkers who did not have to care about this radioactive rain, the other adventurers were all huddled in their bases or wearing special full-body protective clothing as they searched for prey in the rain. The nobles were feasting in the warm hall with fireplace. It was not suitable to go out in this season, so it was the time of the most banquet. Dean was sitting in front of the desk in the laboratory behind the palace. He was reading the information in his hand. Perhaps it was because of the long-term frown, but there were faint wrinkles between his eyebrows. The pitter-patter of rain fell outside. Occasionally, a bolt of lightning would tear through the sky. It was unknown when he had put down the documents in his hands. He sat in front of the desk, silent as usual, like a cold stone statue. 10 years had passed, but there was no progress in the experiment. They had searched every corner of the continent in the last 10 years. The surveillance network had covered every corner of the continent, but they still couldn't find Aisha's figure. It meant that there was a possibility that she would leave the continent. There was also the possibility of dying. God is omnipotent. Why can't he reverse time? Dean frowned deeply. In the past 10 years, in addition to studying the undead, he had also been studying the mystery of becoming a god. The birth of God was an accident. There was only the result, but no method. He continued to look for the correct method in the experiments of the demonic worm and the origami, but the progress was equally slow. Even with the cooperation of God it was still difficult to explore the deepest secret. Knock. Someone knocked on the door. Dean already knew who it was. He recovered from his thoughts and frowned. Come in. Aurora came in wearing a black skirt. There was a white wavy pattern on the edge of her skirt. She looked at Dean. Your Majesty, you haven't been to the Congress for a long time. Don't you want to see it? There is nothing to see. Everything is peaceful now. There is a little threat from the sea monsters, but it will be solved sooner or later. Dean casually said. Aurora hesitated for a moment. Although the outside is peaceful but the inside isn't. You haven't appeared in front of people for a long time. I don't know where Goddess has gone to play recently. I'm worried that something will happen. Inside? What's wrong? Did someone provoke you? Or is it your husband? Dean looked at her. The biggest change in the last 10 years was that the people who followed him were now married. Noyce had found his beloved woman in the giant wall. Sergei had a harem of hundreds of women. Most of them were noble ladies with graceful posture and elegant appearance. His student, Edward, excelled in the field of research and was surrounded by a large group of women. Barton, Zack, and Macon also had their own places to go. Aurora had grown from a teenage girl to a young woman in her late 20s. She had even given birth to 2 children. Hearing Dean's words, Aurora bit her lips slightly. She was no longer a simple, ignorant, and vengeful girl. After soaking in the power whirlpool of the Empire for 10 years, even if she didn't like these intrigues, she at least understood it. So after hearing Dean's words, she almost suppressed the words that she wanted to say. She knew that in the eyes of Dean, she was the same as Sergei. They were all ministers. Even if they were the closest people to Dean, they had to act in accordance with the laws of the country. Otherwise there would be chaos. Your Majesty. Aurora felt bitter. You haven't appeared for a long time. Don't you want to see the development of the dynasty? Dean shook his head. There is nothing to see. I know the general situation. What do you want to say? Aurora opened her mouth slightly, and 2 small and cute faces suddenly flashed across her mind. Her heart twitched slightly, and her eyes dimmed. She lowered her head and said, It's nothing, Your Majesty. I came to report to you about the Oceanic Beast Research Institute. They have already created a drug that can degenerate the sea beast. It can be mass-produced for all the sea beasts that have been hunted so far. I know, Dean said. This is a national affair. You can talk about it in the Congress. There is no need to tell me. Aurora bowed. Yes. Aurora stood for a while as if she was thinking about something. She didn't say anything and slowly left the study room. Dean took back his eyes and continued to pick up another roll of experimental data. He stopped and muttered to himself, What is she trying to imply? She wants me to go to the Congress? Is there a problem with the Congress? He felt strange as he thought of this. Although he hadn't managed the affairs of the dynasty for a long time, but he knew most of the things that were happening outside. The country was peaceful and its territory was expanding steadily. The land monsters were completely expelled. The remaining ones were kept in captivity. It was like a zoo in the old era. They had established a special hunting paradise. In addition to the sea monsters occupying the people's attention, there was basically no major event worthy of his attention. She is hesitating. Is she being coerced? Or is it because of Barton and the others that she wants to talk about? Dean's eyes were full of thoughts. After a moment, he called the guard outside to inform his parents that he would attend the Congress tomorrow. Not long after the order was issued, his parents suddenly rushed over to see Dean. "Son, are you finally willing to give up these experiments and take care of the country?" Mother looked at him with a happy face. Dean looked at them and thought of Aurora's words. He asked, "Mother, is there anyone who is domineering recently? Has he formed a clique?" Mother was surprised. "Why do you ask? Did you hear what they said? Forming a party is a big crime. Who would dare to do so? You are the only god in the world, and you are under the protection of God Wa. Who would dare to form a party? Isn't it a rebellion?" Dean nodded. "That's true. I'm afraid that these people are working in the dark. Their purpose is not for the throne but to raise their status and live a better life." Mother thought for a moment. "It makes sense. Your father and I will investigate this matter." "How is it? Is there any progress in the experiment?" Father asked. Dean sighed and shook his head. "You are doing experiments all day. It is easy to have bottlenecks in your thinking. Tomorrow is the day of prayer. We have prepared a special altar that can eliminate part of the nuclear fallout. Do you want to go and have a look?" Father laughed. "Yes, go out and relax. You can't always be cooped up. Your sister has prepared a surprise for you." His mother immediately echoed. Dean looked at them and nodded. "All right, let's go out." Then he got up and the family of 3 went out of the study and left the palace. Maybe the Demon Emperor found a spaceship that was buried underground and left Earth. I don't know if the origami race has been completely wiped out or if they will make a comeback. Father, don't worry. According to the information I got from the origami spaceship, the number of origami clan is very small. Many of them were lost in the Doomsday War. Most of them are only remnants. I will go and destroy them when I have time in the future. Dean smiled. Origami and demonic insects must be completely wiped out. Otherwise they will sneak into the solar system and attack the Earth from space. We will all be finished. Father's eyes showed a trace of seriousness. Dudian nodded. It's impossible to hide from the detection of the moon and snipe the Earth from a long distance. I estimate that it will take at least 100 years of development. In another 10 years, I will go to the moon with God of Wa and destroy them. Since you've decided to go, why don't you go in advance? His mother couldn't help but ask. Dudian shook his head. The journey back and forth will take at least a few years. I want to find her as soon as possible and crack the undead virus. The more I delay, the less hope I have. Son, this is about the survival of the entire planet. You can't treat it as a child's play. Mother said. Dean looked at her face for a moment. What does the planet have to do with me? People can be reborn. If they can't, I can make them again. Both of them looked at each other. After a moment, the carriage stopped in a crowded square. There was a huge statue erected in the square. It was Dean's appearance. There was a dragon's head altar in the middle of the square. It was like a dragon's head stretched out from the ground and looked up at the sky. It was quite spectacular. This is it. Mother lifted the curtain and looked out. She smiled and turned to Dean. Your sister has been waiting for a long time. Let's go down. The 3 of them got out of the carriage. The nobles and rich people who were shopping around had already avoided the emperor's carriage. They were full of joy and curiosity. They wanted to see the appearance of the world's ruler. Dean soon sensed his sister's aura. He was eating tea in a restaurant next to the square. This restaurant was one of the top restaurants in Royal City. Many noble ladies who wanted to eat here had to make an appointment in advance. When he sensed his sister's aura, his sister also seemed to sense him and moved towards him. Soon, Dean saw a girl full of youthful aura. She was carrying a small food box in her hand. She walked quickly out of the crowd. Dad, Mom. Annie walked briskly and soon came in front of the 3 of them. The crowd was crowded, but there was a large empty space near the three of them. People who were casually shopping stopped and looked at them. "Brother!" Annie saw Dean in front of her and said with a smile, "Look what delicious food I brought for you." Father suddenly felt a creepy feeling hit his chest, and he hurriedly retreated in panic. Looking from the side, he suddenly appeared in front of Dean, and then quickly retreated. When he returned to his original place, he seemed to be frightened, gasping for breath, and his face was slightly pale. Whoosh! Dean didn't look back, but he could see that several sharp blades were coming out of Danny's body. She was stabbing towards him. Her ability was the magic marks of the splitter. Dean was silent and did not seem to react. But the moment Annie rushed over, a sharp blade more than 10 meters long suddenly ejected from his back. Puff! It instantly pierced through Annie's shoulder. The protruding blade at the front of the sharp blade pushed her body back. She was thrown to the square behind her. Half of her body was dyed red and dripping with blood. They were both using the magic marks of Splitter, but Dean's use of the magic marks and the accumulated energy in his body was far more than Annie's. The speed of constructing the sharp blades was more than 10 times faster than Annie's. At this time, a large number of heavily armed guards rushed out of the chaotic crowd. One of them rushed toward Dean and said, "Your Majesty, we have come to escort you." Before he could get close, a sharp blade popped out from Dean's arm. Bang! The blade pierced his chest armor, but the armor was not penetrated on the spot. The guard flew out and fell to the ground. The rest of the guards immediately surrounded him, but stopped approaching. Their eyes were exposed from behind the helmet. They looked at Dean nervously and fearfully. "This thing has protected your aura. If you don't deliberately sense it, then it's easy to ignore it. Is this the reason why you betrayed me?" Dean's eyes swept over the guards and finally fell on his father and mother in front of him. He slowly said, "You chose to attack me in the most bustling area to reduce my vigilance. You thought that there wouldn't be any danger in this bustling area. I can see that you have planned this for a long time." "Why?" he asked again. "Kill." The answer was a cold word. The surrounding people dressed as guards seemed to have received an order and immediately swarmed forward. However, Dean's eyelids twitched slightly as soon as they made their moves. Although he had expected a lot of things from the assassination of his parents, he still didn't expect that these people were all king-level existences. They exposed their aura and body energy as soon as they made their moves. There were more than 100 of them. He had a general understanding of the king-level existences of the dynasty. Except for Barton, Sergei and others, there were no more than 10 king-level existences. However, the number of king-level existences in front of him was 10 times more than he knew. It must be known that every king-level existences had destructive power that was no less than a mobile nuclear bomb. If hundreds of king-level existences attacked crazily, then the entire planet would be destroyed. It seems that you have been planning for a few years. Was it 10 years ago or 8 years ago? Dean's eyes gradually became cold. His body suddenly swelled as he was surrounded by the king-level existences. From his fingers, arms, shoulders, chest, knees and other parts of his body, dark blades were shot out. They were dozens of meters long and were covered with dark energy. They had the destructive power to annihilate all matter. Lightning body. Nothingness. Gravity. Many king-level existences used their own abilities as they saw Dean take the initiative to attack. Some used their life-saving abilities, some used their offensive abilities to attack, some used their controlling abilities to restrict Dean's movement, and some sang treacherous songs to use their spiritual attacks to attack Dean's brain. The next moment, hundreds of blades swept out and cut the bodies of more than 20 king-level existences. These king-level existences relied on their strange defensive methods to resist Dean's blade attack. However, the next moment they screamed as their bodies flew out. In just one attack, Dean severely injured more than 20 king-level existences and beheaded 6 of them on the spot. On the other hand, Dean had received long-range attacks from more than 30 kings. These were energy-based attacks, but there seemed to be a layer of protective film on the surface of his body. All the attacks fell on his body, but he was unscathed. Even the strange spiritual attacks that attacked his brain were like stones sinking into the sea. They were completely shielded. How is this possible? Everyone's eyes almost protruded out of their sockets as they looked at the scene in disbelief. Hundreds of king-level existences attacked at the same time. Even the entire king's city would be smashed into pieces. How could Dean block all of them at the same time? More than 20 king-level existences who relied on their strong defense were the most frightened ones. At the moment, their wounds were cut by the blades and blood kept flowing out. In addition, there was a corrosive force that was constantly eroding their bodies. It was like a plague virus that forced them to quickly divide new cells to replace the injured cells. However, the speed of division barely kept up with the speed of corrosion, which made the wounds unable to heal. Chapter 1266. His abilities are too complicated. Our attacks are all ineffective. It's like we are being assimilated. Is he a god? Isn't he a quasi-god? Isn't he relying on the sage's engine to barely surpass the king level? Why is this happening? Everyone looked at the demonic figure in horror. They felt that they were experiencing a nightmare. They wanted to wake up quickly, but they knew that death was the only way to free them from this nightmare. The first step of their plan was to cooperate with Dean's biological parents and sister. They would choose a place with many people to lower Dean's vigilance and wait for an opportunity to launch a sneak attack. It would be the best if they could kill him in one blow. Whether it was the environment or the person who would launch a sneak attack, it was easy to make Dean lose his guard. They estimated that the success rate of the sneak attack was as high as 70%. However, the sneak attack failed. However, they had already prepared a complete plan. The second step was for all of them to attack at the same time and kill Dean in seconds. There were more than 100 king-level experts gathered here. They knew how powerful they were. Let alone hundreds of king-level experts. Even 2 or 3 king-level experts wouldn't be able to resist. According to their investigation, although Dean was strong, he was only a demigod. He was embedded in the philosopher's engine, so he could stimulate the potential of his body. However, he was only a demigod. He was far from being an omnipotent and invincible god. They were sure to kill him as long as he wasn't a monster like Godwa that couldn't be killed by Big Ivan. Moreover, they knew that Dean had a fatal weakness. It was his heart. Once the sage's engine in his heart was destroyed, he wouldn't be able to live for long. Moreover, his combat strength would be directly reduced to the king level. Hundreds of king-level experts would be enough to turn him into a meat patty. However, the second step of their plan also failed. To them, they had already made sufficient preparations, but all their efforts had been for naught. Moreover, the power exposed by Dean was much stronger than what they had imagined. In just one confrontation, 6 people were killed, more than a dozen were injured, and the rest didn't touch Dean's blade. If they had touched it, most of them would have been seriously injured or dead. This terrifying sharp blade was like an electric baton that could not be touched. Once touched, one would fall to the ground. The number of people doesn't mean anything. Dean slightly raised his eyes and indifferently glanced at the eyes behind the armor. The material of the armor was special, so his X-ray vision couldn't penetrate it. Even the sharp blade could barely pierce through it. Otherwise, the previous attack would have killed more than 6 people. You! Father saw this scene, and there was no half of the familiar and kind appearance of Dudian in the past, but as if there was a deep hatred between him and Dudian. His face was almost distorted, there was both anger and fear. Although you've become kings, it hasn't been long, and your control over your own power is too weak. Compared to the kings who once dominated the imperial capital, you're much weaker. Dean looked around and said indifferently, but even the former kings are just ants in front of me. There is no difference between us. Numbers don't represent strength. Just like 100 eggs can't break a stone. Even if there are 1,000 or 10,000 eggs, it will still be the same. Dean's indifferent voice floated in the square in addition to the frightened crowd that was gradually moving away. Everyone looked at him in horror. Dean's words were like a knife that hit their hearts. Don't listen to his nonsense. His strength is limited, and he may not be able to use that kind of attack more than a few times. We have to kill him even if we have to exhaust him to death. We have no way out. Sister Danny climbed up from the pool of blood on the square and said while gritting her teeth. Everyone heard her words and hesitated for a moment. They thought of the mountains of corpses and seas of blood under the feet of the Emperor, and the blood on his hands. They immediately rushed over again. Ignorant! Dean looked indifferent. Although he was a little surprised by the hundreds of kings, it didn't mean that they could defeat him. Lin Chongqing had more than 200 years of vast memory and knowledge. Although he wasn't a real god, he had a richer application of abilities than the god of Wa. Moreover, the speed of the philosopher's engine to mobilize the body's energy made him far above the ordinary kings. Even the god of Wa might not be able to defeat him in a short time. Of course, he couldn't defeat the god of Wa either. Instead, she would secretly learn and adapt to him. Toxic touch, dungeon cage, magic arrow. All the kings used their special skills, and all kinds of energy rampaged in the air. The ground under the plaza cracked open, and the buildings in the surrounding shopping street collapsed. The nobles and tycoons who were running away in panic were burned alive by the high temperature. Some were struck by the lightning that filled the air and were electrocuted to ashes, leaving nothing behind. The raging flames dyed the sky red, and the dark green poisonous gas spread in the air. It was like a doomsday scene. The whole king's city was affected by the attacks of many kings, and there were countless casualties. Whoosh, whoosh. One by one, the kings with extraordinary fighting ability rushed towards Dean. Some transformed into half-human half-dragon, some looked like bat-winged demons, and some were covered with sharp scales. At this moment, they swarmed towards Dean from all kinds of tricky angles. Dean's eyes slowly narrowed, an array of cold light flashed. His body suddenly swept out, and the sharp blades on his body danced like a group of snakes, killing the crowd. Ah! I dodged. Why is it like this? Damn! There is something invisible. More than a dozen kings were injured and 4 of them were killed on the spot. The rest of the kings were scared by Dean's fierce offensive. Although they knew that they had the advantage in numbers, but at the moment the huge number didn't give them the slightest sense of security. Their vision was not ordinary, and they could see that it was almost impossible to defeat Dean by relying on numbers. Some people made a prompt decision and retreated. The kings were defeated even faster and earlier than the ordinary soldiers. If it was a team of 100 soldiers, they might only think of retreating when there were only a dozen or so soldiers left. However, the kings were far smarter than the ordinary soldiers, so they understood the situation much earlier and chose to retreat even earlier. Perhaps this was why when a group of smart people gathered together, they would become a group of smart pigs. Duani couldn't believe what she saw. She didn't expect that the kings didn't have the ability to fight against Dean. It was a complete one-sided slaughter. It was the first time that they saw Dean show extraordinary strength. The last time was when Dean killed the Qilin king. But the battle ended quickly and they couldn't see anything. Since Dean had built the dynasty, all the matters were handed over to Barton and others to deal with. He stayed in the laboratory and almost didn't fight. Therefore they didn't have a strong concept of the quasi-deity. They could only speculate from Dean's previous battles. But they didn't personally observe those battles. They didn't expect that the gap between a king and a quasi-deity was bigger than the gap between a hunter and the abyss. Macon. Dean's sharp blade cut off the arm of a king. His eyes narrowed as he saw the king's face. But soon he loosened his eyes. He didn't wait for the king to speak as his sharp blade flashed and cut off the king's head. He chased after the other kings like a hungry wolf, his unstoppable blades easily piercing through their bodies. Even if their bodies had been transformed into energy, they could not withstand it. The structure of his blades was not a simple cutting blade. Instead, it contained the power of annihilation, as well as other special abilities. After all, with Lin Chongqing's vast knowledge, it was as if he had obtained the abilities of all demonic beasts, or perhaps even more. Today's ending is not going to happen. It's going to happen tomorrow. Writing Pen Chinese Network. Chapter 1268. Run! We are no match for him. The information is wrong. He is a god. Many king-level warriors fled. Some tried to fight back, but their attacks didn't have any effect on Dean. Even if the attacks were effective and brought damage to Dean, the damage would be healed in an instant. Shadow ability you are. Aurora? Dean saw one of the escaping figures. She was wearing an exquisite silver armor that covered her breasts. At this moment, she used her magic mark ability and turned into a shadow. She blended into the shadows of other kings. This was a 5-star legendary ability that Aurora had selected and strengthened. She was second to none in terms of survival and assassination. She was also called the Shadow Queen. Whoosh! A cold light flickered in his eyes, and a shadow suddenly extended from one of the sharp blades. It flew out, and in the blink of an eye, it caught up with the shadow of a king. The next moment, a figure suddenly flew out from inside. It was the silver-armored female knight who had turned into a shadow. The sharp blade suddenly changed direction, becoming as soft as kelp. It shot out a bolt of lightning and struck the armor on top of his head, revealing a face with tears in her eyes. It was Aurora, who had reported the matter to him earlier. Dean's indifferent eyes flashed as he saw her sad face. The sharp blade bypassed her and pierced through the body of a king behind her, tearing it apart. "Divine Cage!" Dean shouted in a low voice. Suddenly, the ground within a radius of dozens of miles cracked, and a large number of white silk shot out from inside, converging into the sky, like a snow-white bowl upside down on the ground, shrouding the area. Ordinary dignitaries and rich businessmen in this area were also imprisoned. They knelt on the ground in horror and begged loudly. In the next moment, white spiderweb-like spears shot out from the inner walls of the cage, piercing down from the sky like raindrops. The indiscriminate attack turned the entire land into a purgatory. Countless civilians were instantly pierced through. The silver spiderweb-like spears had strong corrosive properties, and the bodies of those who were pierced quickly melted, turning into puddles of blood. The guards who were guarding this area were also hit by this attack. All the escaping kings were horrified. They didn't expect that the emperor's methods were so cold. It was far more cruel than they had imagined. Even the innocent people were not spared. They thought of their previous judgment and discussion. Once again, they felt the coldness of the emperor's heart and the indifference to life. "It's useless. I have strengthened the divine cage. You can't break it with your abilities." Dean's indifferent eyes glanced at the kings who had escaped more than a dozen miles away. His perception locked on their figures. Many of the kings had already tried to attack the cage in the sky, but this cage was tougher than they had imagined. Regardless of whether it was physical attacks or energy-based attacks, they were all absorbed. Even if someone managed to tear a hole in the cage, there was another layer of cage outside the hole. It was a despairing scene. Some kings tried to drill into the ground to escape. However, they found that the cage was also entangled by the silver thread. The cage was a complete sphere. "Is your reason the same as Barton's?" Dean didn't pay attention to the panicked kings. He looked down at Aurora. Aurora's eyes were red. "Your Majesty, my husband has made a big mistake. I know that he has been schemed against by others. But if you know about it, you won't let him go. So I can only help them. I'm sorry. I only hope that I can use my life to exchange for a peaceful life for them. Even if it's as an ordinary civilian. I hope that you won't be angry at them. At this point, the shadow behind her suddenly surged and turned into a sharp blade, piercing her heart from behind. Blood overflowed from the corner of her mouth. Her heart had burst out with blood. Please give me a chance to avenge my sister. I have been longing for a family. My children are innocent. Your Majesty, I beg you. Aurora looked at Dean in sadness. Her eyes were full of despair as she looked at Dean's indifferent face. Dean stared at her like a statue. He stared at her like a statue. Even when he saw her eyes gradually lose focus, her aura gradually weaken, and her life gradually fade away, there was not a trace of fluctuation. She fell to the ground. Her body was completely dead. He didn't speak. Only the silver spider spear continued to shoot from the sky. However, the area within 100 meters around him wasn't affected by the attack. It seemed that the storm in the world had nothing to do with this place. Family, he muttered to himself. You, don't tell me you'll only stop after you kill everyone here. A voice full of resentment and anger echoed from behind. The next moment Annie's arms turned into scarlet sharp blades as she rushed towards Dean's back. Dean didn't turn around as if he didn't hear her. When Annie was less than 10 meters away from his back, a sharp blade that was as sharp as a sickle suddenly shot out from his back. With a puff, it pierced through Annie's chest and stabbed her in the air. You! Annie looked at him in a daze. The next moment the strange energy attack from the sharp blade invaded her body. Her internal organs were torn. The pain made her beautiful face twist. Immortality, is it really that important? A face slowly emerged from Dean's back, quietly looking at the struggling girl in front of him. Annie writhed in pain, trying to break free from the blade, but there seemed to be a suction force inside the blade that kept her body firmly attached to it. As she struggled, she screamed in pain, "You're a monster! You brought us back to life just to satisfy your inner desires. Sooner or later, you'll kill us too. Sister, you loved me the most from childhood to adulthood. Why are you doing this?" Dean looked at her and asked faintly. Annie seemed to be burned by flames. Her whole body turned into hideous and ugly limbs, slapping and twisting on the sharp blade. She screamed, "Monster, go to hell!" Dean was silent for a moment. The next moment Annie, who was struggling on the sharp blade, suddenly froze. Then she burst into countless pieces of flesh and splashed everywhere. "Sister won't hurt me at all. You are a failure." Dean indifferently glanced at the pieces of flesh on the ground. Then his eyes fell on his parents who were trembling in fear. "You are also," whoosh. His body suddenly flew out, and the sharp blade danced in the air. "Run!" the father roared, and his whole body turned into light, shooting into the distance like a laser. But Dean ejected several sharp blades from his body, and they were even faster than the father. In the blink of an eye, they caught up with the father, pierced his body, and nailed him to the ground. "Failure! Failure!" Dean whispered like a devil. His sharp blades danced, tearing apart the body of his mother, who was ready to escape into the ground. Then he rushed to the front of his father, who was nailed to the ground. Several sharp blades turned into light, but there were other energy residues inside, tearing apart his father's body. After killing them, Dean looked up at the king who was fleeing in panic in the distance, and rushed over again. The killing continued in the cage. One king after another screamed. Some were completely desperate. Seeing Dean rushing over, they directly knelt down and begged for mercy. But they were not spared and were directly obliterated. 10 minutes later, Dean stood in front of the last king. The king was kneeling on the ground, shivering. His face was full of tears. The armor on his head fell to the ground. He didn't know the face of a stranger. Dean was bathed in blood. Every sharp blade was dyed red with blood. The strong smell of blood gushed out, making the king almost suffocate. He desperately kowtowed and begged in a sobbing voice, "Your Majesty, I beg you, I'll do anything you want me to do. Please don't kill me, I beg you. Isn't it better to rely on my parents than to submit to me?" Don't tell me that hundreds of kings have been caught by them? Dean slowly opened his mouth. This was the first time he spoke since the start of the massacre. The king on the ground knocked his head on the ground, his face almost touching the sand, and said in a trembling voice, "Your Majesty, they forced us, we were secretly trained by them, if we didn't listen to them, we would be punished by them, and Your Majesty, you are a god, we can't understand you, you can resurrect the dead, our lives to you are as insignificant as dust, we also had no choice." "Is that so?" Dean said silently. Puff. A sharp blade fell and cut off the king's body. He was killed on the spot. The bloody wind blew gently and lingered around him. Within dozens of miles of the divine cage, no one was left alive, no matter if it was a king or a commoner. The buildings here were also destroyed. It was like a purgatory battlefield. Only he was left standing in this mountain of corpses and sea of blood. Chapter 1269. To the west of the dynasty there was a giant wall. The giant wall was located in a remote mountainous area. It was far away from the capital. Even in the era of information sharing and trade between the giant wall, there was no railway track outside the giant wall. There was no beautiful tourist scenery. It was still overgrown with weeds, hills and swamps mixed in with the wilderness. For the people in the giant wall was their world. In the center of the world, the core of the giant wall, was the king's city. The majestic and imposing buildings formed a forest. In the center of these buildings was the most magnificent and towering palace. In the back garden of the palace, the garden was full of fresh flowers. One of them was a piece of sand. 2 3 or 4-year-old children were lying on the sand. They were piling up sand to build a bunker. They were having a great time playing with the sand. Not far away from him stood a middle-aged man with an imposing appearance. He stood tall and straight with his hands clasped behind his back. He had a head of extremely pure blonde hair and was dressed in a black, form-fitting long suit that resembled a tuxedo. There were a few silver chain decorations embedded on it, making him look slightly noble. He quietly looked forward, gazing at the end of the horizon. The weather over the giant wall was clear. The sky was blue. However, at the end of the sky there was a gray haze. It seemed that a rainstorm was sweeping. He silently stared at the sky and gradually lost in thought. No one knew what he was thinking. "Lord of the Wall!" A soft shout came from the back garden. It was a well-proportioned young man. His face was a little pale, and he looked a little panicked. He hurried to the middle-aged man's side and said, "Something has happened, something big has happened." The middle-aged man awoke from his empty thoughts and slowly turned around. His expression was calm and without any ripples. He said, "What is it?" "Something big happened in the capital city." The youth's voice trembled. "There is a large number of kings in the capital city. They took advantage of the emperor's tour to attack His Majesty. I heard that the main participants seemed to be His Majesty's biological parents. Now the entire capital city is in chaos. It is said that dozens of miles have been razed to the ground. Countless people have died." The middle-aged man was slightly startled. He frowned and said to himself, "Finally, this day has come?" The young man was surprised. "Sir Wall Lord, you already knew?" The middle-aged man slightly shook his head and was about to say something. Suddenly, a hearty voice came from outside the garden. "Noise, didn't you say that there is rose wine here? Where is it?" As he spoke, a burly middle-aged man walked in. His head was shaved bald, and the top of his head was shiny. At this moment, there were a few hickeys left by his red lips, which were very eye-catching. The blond middle-aged man was Noise. He smiled bitterly. "Sergey, clean your head first." Sergey touched his head and wiped a few lipstick marks on his hand. He didn't care. It's just a woman's love. What's there to be unclean about? Take out your rose wine and share it. Noise gestured to the young man next to him to leave. Then he sat down in front of a tea table in the garden. The tea table here was black and white in European style. It was usually used by the ladies to have afternoon tea in the garden. He casually poured a cup of tea on the table and said, "You're not in the mood to drink wine. Have some tea to calm yourself first." Sergei was stunned. Calm myself? What happened? Don't lie to me. Someone tried to assassinate His Majesty. Noy's voice was flat, but the words were shocking. Sergei's eyes widened. Assassinate His Majesty? You're wrong, right? Assassinate which Majesty? Our young master. Noyce lightly said. Apart from him, who else is His Majesty? Sergei was stunned for a moment. Then he laughed. I thought it was a big deal. How can this be regarded as a big deal? Which idiot must be tired of living to actually try to assassinate him? Isn't this the same as trying to light a lantern in the toilet? Noyce rolled his eyes. The people who assassinated him are his biological parents. They are the ones who are now acting as the state's minister and his sister. If I'm not mistaken, Barton and Macon are also involved. Aurora and his student Edward are also involved. Sergei was stunned. After a while, he said, Is there something wrong with your brain? Why are you talking nonsense? Why would his biological parents try to assassinate him? Barton and Macon were also drinking with them a few days ago. We are the first people to follow His Majesty. It's impossible for us to betray him. Why would we participate in it? Furthermore, don't they know how powerful His Majesty is? With just these few people, His Majesty could probably kill them with one slap. Noyce shook his head. My information is a bit late. You are the leader of the Imperial Army. You can access the intelligence network of the dynasty. You should be able to find out the whole story from there. Sergei was startled for a moment. He immediately rolled up his sleeves and quickly entered a password into the watch on his wrist. After a moment, his face suddenly changed. He jumped up from his chair. His body slightly trembled. His head was covered with cold sweat. His face was full of disbelief. How is it? Noyce frowned as he saw Sergei's reaction. Sergei stood there for a long time before he slowly sat down. You're right, the capital is in chaos. There was an assassination attempt, and it was led by His Majesty's biological parent. Barton, Macon, Aurora, Edward, and several others were involved. There were hundreds of kings on the scene, but all of them are dead. Noyce's eyelids twitched. Although he had already predicted it, his heart still trembled when he heard that there were more than 100 kings. But he soon calmed down. Although he was surprised, he guessed that it should be the case. Why? Why did they do this? Sergei asked. He couldn't believe that Barton and Macon, who had followed him, would betray Dean. He didn't believe that Dean's biological parents were the ones who took the lead. Noyce lowered his head and sighed. In the past 10 years, they have fought for the dynasty. Now they have their own families and found their own happiness. Their lives are more comfortable than what they had imagined. They naturally can't accept being deprived of such a life. Sergei's body shook as he looked at Noyce. What did you say? You didn't participate probably because no one was able to find you. They know that you have many women around you, but you are just playing with them. They can't use them to hold you hostage. Moreover, you don't have any children, so you don't have any weaknesses. So naturally you didn't participate. Noyce sighed. Sergei was startled. Are you saying that they were forced? Since they have participated, there's no such thing as being forced. This is the path they have chosen. Unfortunately, they don't know how terrifying His Majesty's true strength is. Noyce shook his head with some regret. Sergei couldn't help but shout. Are their brains broken? Did a pig kick their brains? What good would it do for them to assassinate His Majesty? Isn't the glory and wealth they have now enough for them to enjoy? Isn't their status high enough? His Majesty had given them as much as he could. Their parents are in charge of the dynasty. They aren't emperors, but they are better than emperors. Why would they take such a big risk to do such a thing? Why? Noyce sighed. The human heart is boundless. Acting emperors are still acting. You and I both know that His Majesty has the power of the Creator and can resurrect the dead. How could they not know this? Wouldn't they be worried that if they made a mistake, His Majesty would send them back to the furnace to be reborn? So they are really alive when His Majesty is dead. Sergei replied, but His Majesty doesn't care about these things. His Majesty only cares about Miss Aisha. For His Majesty, power is just a tool for him to play with. He is tired of it. Noyce smiled, but sometimes people may not think that you don't want it. You say that you didn't hit him, but the palm print is there. No one will believe you. Moreover, the mystery of becoming a god will fall into their hands if His Majesty is dead. Who doesn't want to live forever? Who doesn't want to live for 10,000 years? 100,000 years, or even 1,000,000 years. Even if the earth is destroyed, we can still coexist with the universe. But, Sergei said, Goddess Wa is still alive even if His Majesty is dead. She regards His Majesty as her own parent. How can she not avenge His Majesty? Do they want to kill a god? Just by relying on them? That's why Goddess Wa wasn't present during the operation. As far as I know, she left the Earth half a month ago and went to outer space to play. I think she got an order to go to outer space to do something. That's why she hasn't returned yet. Noyce said in a low voice, if the assassination is successful, when she comes back, they can take the place of His Majesty's corpse and weave a set of memories for His Majesty's corpse. They can then use His Majesty's corpse to control Goddess Wa. So, they deliberately lured Goddess Wa away? Otherwise, how would they have the guts to act? Sergei opened his mouth and finally let out a long sigh. Stupid! Why do they have to think so much? Aren't good wine and women good enough to attract them? Why don't they know how to be content? Noyce looked at him, then turned his head towards the two children playing in the sand. Do you want to play with them? Sergei was stunned. He turned around and saw two children piling up sand to build a castle. He couldn't help but laugh. I'm talking to you about something serious. Who has time to play with your children? The two children were naturally Noyce's. He didn't get angry when he heard this. Instead, he smiled faintly and said, You also know that this kind of thing is too childish, so you won't do it. This matter can't attract you, but it can attract them. Similarly, what you think is interesting now, perhaps in their eyes, is as childish and ridiculous as these two kids building a castle. How can they enjoy it like you do? Sergei was stunned. There are very few people in this world who have the same hobby. Everyone loves money. It's not because of the charm of money, but because money can buy different things. Money is just a channel. Noyce slowly said. Different experiences, personalities, preferences, and pursuits. You can't understand them, and they naturally can't understand you. So naturally, they can't understand His Majesty. Why? Sergei was surprised. Because His Majesty is God and we are humans. How can humans understand God? People can only imagine God, guess at God, try to figure out God, but never truly understand God. At this point, Noyce sighed. However, we are social animals. We always need a leader. The leader is the only one, the supreme one. Only he can see the scenery at the top. When he gets the world, he is destined to lose it and separate from the group. He is like a sheep leading the way, a horse pulling a carriage. People can only see his back. Isn't ascending to the peak the same as walking into a dead end? Sergei's expression changed. Do you mean that in His Majesty's eyes, all of our thoughts and pursuits are as boring as a pile of sand? Perhaps. Is this the reason why we have fewer friends as we grow up? When you are a grain of sand, you will form a desert. When you are a stone, you will form a mountain. When you are a bird, you will form a flock. Mature people only seek relative and superficial peace because that is very rare. Sergei sighed. It's a pity that all the killings and sins were borne by His Majesty, but no one will remember his good deeds. Perhaps only the ordinary people will thank him, but their gratitude is too weak and powerless. His Majesty doesn't care about gratitude or not. Perhaps the world's gratitude and the world's hatred doesn't make any difference to him. Noyce shook his head. Not many people will care about what he pursues and cares about. Sergei smiled bitterly and said with nostalgia, I really hope that His Majesty can return to the time when he was in Sylvia. At that time, he was more or less stained with human emotions, but now he is more like a cold god. Noyce's mouth twitched as he thought of the last conversation with Dean. Some things can't go back. Yes, we can't go back. Sergei sighed. Noyce looked into the distance and muttered to himself, everyone will choose the path that they think is right. Everyone will grow and change themselves. The environment will change. The ideals and pursuits of the past may change because they have to adapt to the current living environment. They have to change and abandon it. No one would think that they were on the wrong path, and no one would think that their current way of thinking was bad. Even if they occasionally noticed it, they would know in the depths of their hearts that it was because there was nothing they could do about it. That was because if they wanted to survive, they would have to work hard to maintain the way they were. When we change, it means that we have to abandon our previous selves and abandon our previous wrong thoughts. Everyone knows that we shouldn't keep walking on the wrong path, so we will keep searching for the right path. What's regrettable is that we keep searching, but we never know which path is the right one. Saints can't teach us about this. They can only teach us the stereotypical model of morality. However, the world is complicated. You can't just rely on the word morality. The longer you live, the further you go. So it doesn't matter if it is right or not. In the end we will find the one that suits us. If it suits us, then it may be right. If it is right, then it will not change. Sergei was startled. No wonder you came to this remote giant wall 10 years ago. We couldn't see through you at that time. At that time, His Majesty had just ascended the throne. But you gave up everything and lived in this remote and desolate place. Now I am the only one living in the imperial capital. Others were blinded by greed. Some were forced into the whirlpool of war. They couldn't extricate themselves and ended up like this. You have chosen the right path, and it is the most suitable path for you. There is no right path. Noyce looked at the two children in the distance. There was a trace of doting color in his eyes. Even I feel that today's days are too comfortable. I can't eat or sleep in peace. The war in the imperial capital hasn't spread here. But in the future, this place will not be spared. I just hope that day will come later. Sergei was startled. No, will His Majesty vent his anger on us? With His Majesty's means, it should be easy for him to know our details. We are clean. Moreover, after this incident, His Majesty will not condone such things again. His Majesty will naturally not blame us, but others may not. Noyce looked at him. We are the closest people to His Majesty. I don't know how many people are eyeing our position. They want to replace us and become His Majesty's confidant. Since they can't bring down His Majesty, then they will bring us down. Serving under His Majesty is our greatest pursuit. Sooner or later, the power struggle will penetrate here. Perhaps it has already begun, but we haven't been aware of it yet. Sergei's face slightly changed. With our strength and status, it is impossible for them to assassinate us. Assassination is naturally difficult, but others can use His Majesty's hand to kill us. For example, they can create some opportunities to make His Majesty suspicious of us. Then they can use some means to make His Majesty misunderstand us. Isn't there a chance? Noyce gently smiled. His expression didn't seem to care, but his words were enough to make people shudder. Sergei was startled and couldn't speak for a while. He wasn't afraid of open swords and spears, but it was impossible to guard against the conspiracies hidden in the dark. Is there no way? Sergei couldn't help but put his hope on Noyce. Noyce shook his head. We don't need to think of a way. What kind of person is His Majesty? His Majesty will naturally consider what I said. Instead, he will use us to lure the snake out of the hole. No matter who instigates the relationship between us and His Majesty, he will kill them. After this incident, it is impossible for us to betray His Majesty. How can His Majesty not understand this? Sergei was stunned for a moment. He sighed and said, "That's what I said. His Majesty is wise. You almost scared me when you said that it was dangerous." Noyce chuckled, but there was some bitterness in the corner of his mouth as he said, "His Majesty is naturally wise. Looking at all the countries in the world, even the first emperor of the Huaxia dynasty, who was known as the first emperor of all ages, couldn't compare to our Majesty in terms of great achievements. Even if we give him a map of the world and let him unify the world, he is only the emperor of the human race. He can only call himself the Son of Heaven." What is the Son of Heaven? The Son of Heaven. That's why the emperor has to worship the heavens. On the other hand, His Majesty has not only unified the entire world, he has also unified all the systems. He has also solved the external threat of the human race, banished the demons, and defeated the alien invaders such as the origami and the demonic insects. Just these achievements alone have far exceeded the scope of an emperor. Moreover, His Majesty has evolved to the point where he is almost like a god. His Majesty is no longer an emperor but a god. If the ancient emperors are the Son of Heaven, then our Majesty is the Heaven. Heaven? Sergei was startled. That's right. His Majesty is close to the level of God. He is indeed not comparable to an ordinary emperor. In this way, we don't have to worry too much. If there is any danger, His Majesty will solve it in advance. The smile on Noyce's face slowly disappeared. Of course, heaven is more noble than the Son of Heaven. But what is heaven? Sergei was puzzled as he did not understand. Heaven is fair. Noyce stared at him and said, "Whether you are beautiful or ugly, noble or lowly, you can't escape death. Whether it is the barren swamp or the flourishing city, when the rainy season comes, everything will be wet. The heavens will not give you extra care because of your prayers, nor will they punish you with lightning because of your evil curse. Heaven is high above the clouds, overlooking all living beings, not moved by the joy of living beings, nor will it care for the misery of living beings. When there is a drought, rain will not fall on you because of your pity. When there is a flood, it will not stop because of the destruction of your home. Heaven follows the rules of heaven. The happiness and anger of the world have no effect on it. If you beg, then it is just a coincidence. After all, the world is full of suffering, and there are tens of thousands of people who beg. There will always be a blind cat bumping into a dead mouse. That is heaven." Sergei was startled. After a long time, he reacted. His face turned ugly. "You mean, His Majesty will become as ruthless as the sky?" Noyce didn't answer directly. No matter what, His Majesty always has his own considerations. We only need to follow the rules of His Majesty. Don't think too much about it. At least we are at peace now. The future is too far away. To pursue eternal peace is an extremely cruel war. Isn't it the most ridiculous thing in the world to pursue peace through war? Writing a chapter in the middle of the night. Tomorrow morning I will pick up my wife. Chapter 1272. But all peace is bought by war. This is something that cannot be changed. We can't change the will of His Majesty. Sergei sighed. After a while, Noyce whispered, "Indeed, this is something that cannot be changed. Just like how we will be destroyed, there is no way to stop it. Living in this post-apocalyptic world, who can escape from the sea of bitterness? Climb ashore and go to the thorn prison." Destroyed? Sergei frowned. "What do you mean?" Noyce gently leaned on the chair as he looked up at the blue sky. He felt that the clouds were floating very fast. It seemed that a large number of people were gathering here. He faintly said, In the past, I always thought that I could get rid of the predicament and end the suffering by relying on my own efforts. But after I went to prison, I realized that there are many things that you can't change. Sometimes you don't have to deal with one person, but the system that has lasted for hundreds or thousands of years. Moreover, you have to deal with the entire empire, even the civilians of the entire empire. When you want to change, you have to destroy everything. If you don't want to change, then you can only be destroyed or assimilated. You will become the least prominent person in the crowd. Noyce paused for a moment. After I got out of prison, I followed His Majesty and grew up. Now I have climbed to the status of a king. My vision has expanded from the small giant wall to the whole world. I thought that all the suffering would leave me and I would have no worries in this life. But later I found out that I was wrong. I am no different from the weak prisoner who was trapped in the giant wall of Sylvia. My power is monstrous. I am powerful, but I will eventually die. I will die of old age or be killed. From the moment of birth, the countdown to death is the truth of life. What a sad and pitiful thing! No matter how much you struggle, no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how sorrowful you are, once you die, you will be forgotten by others. Even if someone knows your name and it is passed down for hundreds of generations, what is the point? Who are the people who remember your glorious achievements? Are there any despicable thieves? Rapists? Low-moral pariahs? If so, what's there to be happy about being remembered by these people? Sergei scratched his head and said, "Listening to you, I feel that you are like those poets and literati. All day long you are either praising life or discussing the meaning of life. Living or dying." The meaning of life? Noyce looked at him and chuckled. The meaning of life is meaningless. Whether he was alive or dead, what was the difference? When all life reaches the end, it will be destroyed. Then, new life will be born from the destroyed corpses, and it will continue to struggle and reproduce. In the end, it will still reach the end of destruction. Meaningless. Chapter 1273. Investigate immediately. Dean's face was indifferent. Ever since he issued the search notice, there had been a lot of news about Aisha every year. But after a detailed investigation, none of them were true. Aurora didn't care about Dean's cold attitude. She was still respectful as she turned around and left. Not long after she left, a king by the name of Blood Noble came to the main hall. He was a newly promoted king and had been given the title of Marquis. In the past, kings were peak figures that surpassed even dukes, but now, being able to get the title of Marquis was already quite outstanding. "Your Majesty!" Blood Lord respectfully saluted. Dean didn't look up as he read the information in his hand. "What's the matter?" Blood Baron respectfully replied. "Your Majesty, I got news that Miss Aisha you are looking for appeared in the vicinity of Yen Zhe Mountain. The hunting adventure group said that they saw someone similar to Miss Aisha. But they didn't see it clearly, so they can't be sure." "Yenza Mountain?" Dean slightly raised his eyelids as his eyes fell on Blood Baron. His cold and dark eyes seemed to penetrate the deepest secrets of Blood Baron's heart. "Yenza Mountain is under the jurisdiction of the giant wall of Havana. Since you know about this, why don't you go to the leader of the giant wall of Havana to investigate and report to me?" Blood Prince felt that his secret was exposed in front of Dean. He was embarrassed. "Your Majesty, I have sent people to inquire, but the leader of the wall refused to cooperate with our investigation. I don't want to use force. Although he is a small leader, but he is a relative of your Majesty. I'm afraid of offending him." Dean raised his eyebrows. "Are you saying that Noyce refused to cooperate with you?" Blood Lord bowed. "Your Majesty, please calm down." Dean looked at him but didn't say anything. He raised his wrist and revealed a black watch. He quickly contacted the other side. "Noyce, I heard that there are traces of Aisha near Yenza Mountain. Do you know about it?" "Your Majesty!" Noyce's voice came out of the watch. It was hard to tell whether he was happy or angry. I've heard about this and sent people to investigate. It was confirmed that the news was false. Someone was mistaken. I've severely punished them. I didn't expect that His Majesty would be alarmed. Dean nodded. I heard that Blood Lord had sent people to investigate. Are you not going to cooperate? Blood Baron's body slightly trembled. He didn't expect Dean to confront Noyce in such a straightforward manner. Dean didn't beat around the bush and didn't beat around the bush. Noyce seemed to have expected Dean to say this. Your Majesty, the Blood Baron has sent people to wantonly destroy my territory on the grounds of investigation. I'm sorry I can't cooperate. Dean was silent for a moment. Noyce, you should know what she means to me. I hope you don't lie to me. Noyce replied. Your Majesty, I won't lie to you about this matter. Miss Aisha is Your Majesty's benefactor, and also my benefactor. I'll be the first to find her even if I have to go through water and tread on fire. Dean didn't say anything more as he hung up the communication. He looked at the Blood Baron who was about to say something. Come here. Blood Lord's body trembled. Your Majesty, the Wall Lord is lying. He refused to cooperate. I didn't mean to slander him. It's true. Dean raised his hand and black silk threads shot out from his palm. They wrapped around Blood Lord's body and pulled him in front of him. Blood Lord didn't dare to struggle. He kept begging in fear. Dudian pierced a soft tentacle into his forehead. Blood Baron's body stiffened and soon stopped moving. His eyes stared blankly and his face was sluggish. After a moment, he recovered and saw that the black silk around his body was loosened. His heart was relieved. There's nothing wrong with my memory. He did stop you, and the news about Yenza Mountain is true. Dean whispered as if he was talking to himself, but his cold eyes were always on Blood Baron. You got the news and went to report after being stopped by him. All of this makes sense, but there seems to be something wrong with your memory. Is it missing a blank? Has it been adjusted? Blood Lord, who had just relaxed, narrowed his eyes. His hair stood on end, and he felt as if his soul was about to leave his body. He hurriedly shouted, Your Majesty, I puff! Before he finished his words, his body suddenly exploded, and the flesh and blood splashed all over the hall. The next moment, Dean's body divided into a large number of small blood vessels, like a straw, and the scattered flesh and blood were sucked into his body. Everything returned to its original state, and not even blood was left. Dad? A figure floated in from outside the imperial palace. The figure was pretty and lively. It was Goddess Wa. Under Dean's instruction, she had changed the way she addressed Dean. Goddess Wa looked around. She seemed to see the scattered flesh and blood on the ground. Dad, did someone make you angry? Dean's eyes fell on her. There was a trace of softness in the depths of his eyes. Goddess Wa was absolutely loyal to him. No, I won't be angry because of these little things. Dean smiled. He reached out and stroked Goddess Wa's soft hair. His gentle eyes flashed. Child, are you willing to do anything for your father? With an innocent look, Goddess Wa giggled and said, Of course, I'm willing to do anything you want me to do, Dad. Anything? Dean stared at her. Yes, anything. Goddess Wa blinked at Dean. Dad, are you in trouble? Dean was silent. I've encountered a problem and I can't find a solution. I can't find hope and I can't see the future. That's why I need your help. Can I help you? Goddess Wa blinked her eyes expectantly. Of course. Dean's mouth moved slightly. He looked up at her with gentle eyes. Have you forgotten that God is omnipotent? Goddess Wa tilted her head. But Dad, you have studied my body for years. You said that my body isn't perfect enough. I can't be regarded as a real God. I'm just a false God. I don't have a life core. Yes. Dudian whispered. I used to think that I was limiting your growth as you were just a young God. But later I discovered that a true God is omnipotent. There is no distinction between young and old. There is no distinction between time and space. God is everything. If you were a true God, then you would be able to assimilate the earth. Even if you fall into the depths of the sun, you wouldn't be hurt. But you need to accumulate great power to barely reach it. Holding his hand, Goddess Wa couldn't help but ask, Dad, if I'm not a true God, can I still help you? Dean's body slightly trembled as he bowed his head. It should be possible. Great. Goddess Wa clapped her hands and cheered like a child. It seemed that she didn't care whether she was a true god or a false god. She only cared whether she could help Dean or not. As long as it's useful to Dad, then Dad will need me. Goddess Wa grinned. The last few chapters. Chapter 1274. Havana Giant Wall. A slender young woman stood by the window of the castle and looked at the tall, blond man beside her. She said with a worried expression, His Majesty just contacted you. Do you really intend to hide this matter? The blond man was Noyce, and the young woman beside him was his wife. She gave birth to 2 clever and lovely children for him. Although she wasn't of noble birth, he didn't find fault with her at all. He couldn't help but sigh deeply after hearing this. He withdrew his gaze from the gloomy sky outside the window and turned to look at the beautiful woman. The light shone on her black hair and made it look like it was flowing. A tender feeling arose in his heart. He wanted to take her away from this place and live on an isolated island that no one would ever set foot on. But he knew that this was an extravagant wish. Today's technology was more advanced than that of the old era. Their individual strength was also more powerful. Their footprints were spread all over the world. There was no place for monsters and naturally no place for him. He was in a whirlpool. Trying to escape would only tear him apart. I'll die if I'm exposed one day. But you and the children will be fine. I know him. Noyce sighed. I don't understand. Didn't you say that His Majesty loves this girl the most? In order to find her, he is like a madman and doesn't hesitate to kill millions of people. This is his reverse scale and can't be violated. With your relationship with His Majesty, even if you offend him in other things, he will forgive you. Why do you hide her whereabouts? Once His Majesty knows, even you can't bear his anger. The woman's eyes were red and she couldn't understand his thoughts. Noyce sighed. It's not difficult for someone of my status to live a peaceful life. But if the world is destroyed, where will we find shelter? Although I'm just a nobody, if I can save this world, even if I have to sacrifice my life, I'm willing to do it. Why would the world be destroyed? Isn't it all fine now? All the monsters have been repelled. The monsters in the sea have been killed, and they don't dare to come close to the land. Why are you worried about these impossible things? The woman's face was filled with grief. Although she questioned him with every sentence, her voice was still soft and gentle. However, the more she spoke, the more tears flowed down her cheeks. Noyce smiled bitterly. The monsters were repelled, but they also nurtured the greatest devil. The power of the world fell into the hands of one person, but this person was already tired of life and ignored it. He could destroy it at will, but he could also create it at will. It all depended on his mood. How terrifying is this? However, in this world, there will always be one person who wants to be the king, and the rest will have to crawl and submit. Isn't that the purpose of all wars? The woman looked at him blankly. To become the one and only king, we have already shed the blood of our compatriots. Now that His Majesty has unified the world and there is no more civil war, why do you oppose such a thing? Whether we are united or not, will the war never leave us? The bitterness on Noyce's face was more intense, as if there was a yellow lotus in his mouth. Life is destined to fight since birth. We need to plunder other lives to eat and drink. The existence of life is meaningless. But we have been born. Since we can't choose to live or die, we have to find a way to live our own meaning or live comfortably. There is no threat if the world falls into the hands of others, but His Majesty is different. He is not a human. His heart is close to that of a god. We can't let him find that girl. All the news and clues about her must be erased. Once His Majesty finds her, it will be the end of humanity." The woman was dumbfounded and stammered, "Why? Because that is the last of his humanity." Noyce sighed. His voice revealed infinite exhaustion, and human nature will change and decay. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye. Huge sailboats could be seen everywhere along the coast, as well as an endless stream of adventurers. The sound of bugles and sails could be heard one after another. Huge steam tankers sailed into the sea, and the footprints of humans gradually invaded the mysterious world of the sea. On the other side of the continent, the most prosperous city in the world, rose flowers covered the ground. A large number of sightseeing trains followed the railway tracks to the capital of the imperial city. Outside the imperial palace in the center of the imperial city, there were groups of tourists watching from afar and taking pictures. Dean and a group of scientists were in front of a miniaturized version of the particle collider in the National Research Institute behind the palace. They were observing the data report. There were no undeads in the laboratory, but a variety of high-energy physics research equipment. "Your Majesty, the only way to reverse time is to find the broken wormhole in the space. But we can't pinpoint the specific time," a gray-haired scientist said to Dean. Dean frowned and didn't speak. A youth came into the laboratory. He was the assistant of the top laboratory. He saluted as he saw Dean. "Your Majesty, an apostle is looking for you." Dean's eyes stayed on the particle collider in front of him for a moment. He looked at the old scientist. "No matter how much resources you invest, I want to see you come up with something new in a month." The scientist's face slightly changed. He didn't open his mouth to complain as Dean turned away. He didn't give him a chance to refute. "Your Majesty is possessed. He wants to travel through time and space." Another scientist shook his head and sighed. "The resources in our laboratory are already at the top. It's useless to have more resources. Your Majesty is making things difficult for us." "Forget it. Being in the king's company is like being with a tiger. Let's hurry up." Dean came to the study room and saw a figure in a black robe waiting for him. Dean sat on the chair next to him. "What's the matter?" The apostle in front of him was a newly established institution. It was dedicated to serve him. It penetrated into all levels of the dynasty and monitored the world. "Your Majesty, there's news about Miss Aisha." The apostle bowed his head and said. As soon as he finished speaking, he felt as if all the air in the room had been sucked out. There was an inexplicable feeling of suffocation. His originally tense heart beat twice uncontrollably. His face turned slightly pale, and his heart was filled with shock. Although he knew that this great emperor's martial strength was the best in the world, he didn't expect it to be even more terrifying than he had imagined. It had far exceeded the concept of a king. "Are you sure?" A low and slightly hoarse voice came from above. The air seemed to turn into a sharp sword that pierced the body of the black-robed man. "Where is she?" "Your Majesty, we found her at the grass giant wall. We have confirmed that she is waiting for you there." The black-robed man suppressed the trembling in his heart and said reluctantly. As soon as he finished speaking, he felt that the suffocating air in the room suddenly disappeared. It was as if the ancient ice on his body had suddenly melted. He couldn't help but be startled. He looked up, but he didn't see Dean in front of him. "Tomorrow they will return to Shanghai." Chapter 1275. Grass Giant Wall. Located in the coastal area, the flow of people was dense and bustling. It was one of the paradise for adventurers and businessmen. This place was close to the sea. The entrance fee for tourists and adventurers was comparable to the income of several months in other cities of the Giant Wall. Not to mention the taxes on goods traded here. It was an astronomical figure. It was so huge that it was enough to make the king envious. In 2 days, It will be our giant glass walls sacrificial sale festival. Ina, look, this is the orchid dragon jadeite of Rant Giant Wall. It is a specialty of that place. The natural golden silk inside is said to be insect eggs. Insect eggs? That's disgusting. I want roses. Well, I will buy roses for you. Roses are much cheaper than orchid dragon jadeite. Well, I want Chinese redbud roses. This is 100 gold coins. Are you willing to spend it? Of course, for you I am willing to do anything. People were coming and going in the streets of the giant wall. A few years ago the festival was coming. The city was very lively. Small wooden boat figurines were hanging on the side of the street lamp. A figure floated in the crowd. He was inconspicuous, but if you noticed him you would never be able to move your eyes away from him. The figure passed by the couple on the side of the road and suddenly stopped. His eyes fell on the purple rose in the girl's hand. Each petal of the rose had a complex pattern. It had a noble and mysterious feeling. This was the most expensive and the rarest variety of rose. Purple, the figure murmured. What are you looking at? The girl noticed that the strange eyes were staring at the Chinese redbud rose in her hand. She raised her eyebrows and said with slight displeasure. The youth next to her gently smiled and said, Ina, don't be angry. I guess he also wants to buy a bunch of Chinese redbud roses for his girlfriend. But he doesn't have the money. After all, there are not many people like me who are willing to spend 100 gold coins to buy a bunch of roses. That's true. The girl heard the words and showed a sweet smile. She was very satisfied with the rose. Boss, here are the Chinese redbud roses. Wrap them up for me. At this moment, the unfamiliar figure next to them spoke. His voice was very gentle and he had a smile on his face. He did not seem to care about the couple's words at all. The florist looked up at him and said with a smile, You want a bouquet too? Redbud roses cost 100 gold coins per bouquet. I don't bargain here. Wrap them all up, the stranger said with a smile. As soon as he said that, whether it was the florist or the couple next to him, they were all stunned. They looked at him in astonishment, as if suspecting that their ears were playing tricks on them. You want all of them? The florist was stunned. The stranger took out a golden card and said, Swipe the money from here. Gold card? The florist took the card. He was a little curious. He had only seen a silver card and a black card. The highest level card was a red card. It was made by a big shot in the grass giant wall. This was the first time he had seen a gold card. I have 1,423 Chinese redbud roses here. I'll give you the change. It will cost 142,000 gold coins. Are you sure? The florist looked at the stranger suspiciously. Even the nobles wouldn't spend more than 100,000 gold coins to buy roses as gift. After all, roses were disposable and would soon wither. Redbud roses were considered as luxury good. All of them. The stranger smiled again and nodded. The florist thought for a moment. He took the gold card and swiped it on the machine. He didn't want the other party to go back on his word. Then he would have to suffer for nothing. When the gold card was swiped on the machine, the florist suddenly found that there was no password set on the gold card. The balance interface flashed and he saw countless zeros. The florist was stunned. The stranger put away the gold card and waited quietly with a smile. The couple next to him saw that the stranger actually paid more than 100,000 gold coins for the roses. They were speechless. The girl suddenly felt that the bouquet of Chinese redbud roses in her hand was a bit shameful. She even wanted to throw it away and run away. Soon the florist had wrapped all the Chinese redbud roses. He politely said to the stranger, Do you need us to help you? It's inconvenient for you to carry so many. The stranger didn't wait for him to finish his words. A few arms sprang out from under his clothes and held the roses. He lifted them a few meters above his head to avoid being messed up by the crowd. Then he quickly left the florist shop. The man stopped when he passed by a clothing store. He thought for a moment and then entered the clothing store. When he came out again, he had changed into a very handsome black and gold suit. It was a noble and gorgeous temperament. He combed his hair neatly and put on a formal suit. He held the roses and walked towards the inner city of the grass giant wall. The streets were crowded with people. There were also many noble carriages with gold-inlaid carriages. If ordinary people were playing together, once they let go of each other's hands, they might not be able to find each other again. They could only contact each other by means of communication. However, in his perception, he could still clearly sense that familiar aura despite being separated by a vast sea of people, countless figures, carriages, and buildings. It was like a red lantern waiting for him there. He couldn't stop the smile on his face. He was extremely excited and happy. He was unprecedentedly nervous. Even if it was the coronation ceremony, he could keep calm. But at this moment, he was so excited that he couldn't help but want to jump and walk. In a bustling old Chinese restaurant, a girl in a purple cheongsam was sitting on the third floor. The environment here was relatively quiet. The noise of eating and drinking downstairs was not so noisy. She was leaning against the carved railing. Her snow-white skin and beautiful cheeks were extremely eye-catching. It attracted the attention of other diners on the third floor. But everyone could see that this woman was not an ordinary girl. There were a few dishes and 2 jars of wine on the table in front of her. She only drank wine and didn't eat. Wine and water were the only human food that she could swallow. But wine tasted better than water, because the wine got hotter and the water got colder. She still remembered that there was once a person who liked to give her wine. During that time, he had been accompanying her. She didn't know how to face that person or herself, so she could only drink. She drank mouthful by mouthful. During this process, her thoughts seemed to stop and she didn't think. Suddenly, her eyes narrowed. The next moment, she suddenly sat up straight. Bang! The wine bottle in her hand fell to the ground. The other peeping diners on the third floor were shocked. They thought that they had been discovered and immediately lowered their heads to eat. But she didn't even look at these people. She just stared blankly at the end of the street. The purple color was especially eye-catching in the crowd. As it approached, the most eye-catching thing was the person under the purple color. That familiar face. Why is he here? She suddenly panicked. She looked left and right, wanting to find a place to quickly escape. But soon, her rationality made her quickly consider the current situation. The other party was most likely here for her. She couldn't hide. And should she continue hiding? Looking at the face that was brimming with smiles, she was stunned. Tears suddenly flowed from the corners of her eyes. That silly smiling face no longer had the murderous aura of a monarch. She covered her mouth. Her shoulders twitched lightly. Tears fell like rain and stained her cheek. The figure in the crowd also seemed to have noticed the beautiful scenery in the tavern. His eyes became even more excited, and his footsteps involuntarily quickened. He squeezed through the crowd around him, but it seemed that he wasn't fast enough. His body flew up into the air. As soon as he flew up, the crowd exclaimed. No one had expected that someone would be bold enough to fly in the giant grass wall. This was a violation of the grass wall's laws. However, no matter how many exclamations there were, they didn't attract his attention. His eyes were only focused on the breathtakingly beautiful figure in the tavern. A pair of pure white wings appeared on his back and flapped gently. He was like an angel holding a large number of Chinese redbud roses as he flew to the third floor of the tavern. The two of them were only separated by a railing. They looked at each other silently. Time seemed to have stopped at this moment. All the sounds seemed to have faded away. Chapter 1276. Dean stared at the girl in a daze. It seemed that time had not flowed the slightest trace on her body. She was still as young and beautiful as he remembered. Even the fragrance exuded from her body was so nostalgic. This familiar smell instantly brought him back to that era. "You! Do you remember me?" He trembled, but found that his throat was dry and hoarse. He was so nervous that he seemed to be unable to speak. He used to be calm in the face of millions of lions. He managed hundreds of millions of people indifferently, but now in front of her, he seemed to have taken off all his defenses. He was so nervous that he was at a loss. Hearing Dean's words, more tears flowed from Aisha's eyes. According to scientific research, the undead had no tears. They had no lacrimal glands or emotions. Even if they were born with a second consciousness, they only had thinking consciousness, but not human emotions. But at this moment, her tears flowed like running water. Those few words were like raindrops hitting her heart. The memories that accompanied her were in her heart bit by bit. "How could I not remember you?" Dean didn't wait for an answer, but he had already seen the answer from her tears. His heart was agitated. At this moment, he didn't care about anything else. He crossed the fence and hugged her. Her slender and delicate body was still as cold as ever. This coldness reminded him that she was still an undead. But could an undead shed tears? Even if she was an undead, so what? As long as he could see her, he already felt that it was a gift from God. He hugged her tighter and tighter. He almost wanted to integrate her into his body. He wanted to pass the heat from his chest to her body and warm her cold body. He wanted to smell the fragrance of her hair and engrave it in his heart. He wanted too much, too much. The two quietly hugged each other. No words, but it was better than 1,000 words. On the third floor of the pub, many diners cast their eyes. Some were jealous, some were envious, and some were gloating. Downstairs of the pub, many busybodies gathered, pointing and talking, waiting for the law enforcement to come and punish this arrogant person. Many local residents of the grass giant wall looked at him with sneering eyes. It seemed that they were looking at a foreigner who didn't follow the rules and was about to be taught a lesson. A long, long time passed. Dean and Aisha separated from each other. Although their minds were on each other, but their powerful senses were still disturbed by the noise around them. Dean held Aisha's soft hand. His eyes were as gentle as water. "Let's go. I'll take you to a place where no one is around. I have a lot to say to you." Aisha gently nodded and said, "I also have a lot to say to you." In the distance, a team of law enforcers rushed over. Under the expectant eyes of the people on the street, they flew to Dean's back, but they didn't yell at him. Instead, they knelt on one knee in the air and bowed. "Greetings, Your Majesty! Greetings, Your Majesty!" Now that all the giant walls were connected to the internet, naturally there was a monitoring system. The monitoring system would identify Dean's identity at the first moment. The law enforcers gathered in a hurry to pay their respects. In their minds, this great emperor had been living in the imperial palace for a long time and rarely came out. He was in charge of the lives of the people in the world. Even a giant wall like glass was nothing in front of this great emperor. How could they dare to neglect him? Dean didn't respond to such greetings. In his eyes, there was only the beautiful woman beside him. She slowly flew higher and gradually disappeared from people's sight. On the ground, many busybodies were shocked when they heard the voice of the law enforcer paying his respects. They didn't expect that this daring person was actually the legendary great emperor who drove away the demons and unified the world, who was almost like a god. For a time, a large number of civilians knelt down on the street and kowtowed. They didn't get up for a long time. Above the clouds, there was a flock of thunderbirds hovering. Dean held Aisha's waist in his hand and flew to the back of a leading thunderbird. This thunderbird's wings were more than 10 meters long. Its back was enough for a dozen people to lie down. At the moment it let Dean land. It didn't dare to resist. It lowered its speed and slowly flew forward. "These flowers are for you." Dean handed the bauhinia roses to Aisha and said softly. Aisha glanced at them and then moved her eyes. The tears in her eyes had been wiped away. Her eyes were full of tenderness. Flowers are what every girl likes. Although flowers are beautiful, I would rather look at you than waste this time to watch them. Dean slightly pursed his lips. I finally found you. I won't let you leave me again. You will have time to see me every day, every moment, every minute. We will see each other for the rest of our lives. 100 years, 1,000 years. I will make you a god. You will live forever. Aisha shook her head slightly. It's too difficult to become a god. It's fine as long as we are together. Dean gently smiled and didn't continue. Instead, he asked, your memory seems to have recovered. Where have you been all these years? Don't you know that I'm looking for you? Aisha slightly bowed her head. There was a bit of guilt in her eyes. My memory is quite chaotic. I just straightened it out recently. I know that you are looking for me, but I dare not let you find me. I am already an undead. I know that you are studying a way to restore the undead, but there have been no results in all these years. I know that I can't go back. I don't want you to see my ugly appearance now. Dean was startled. After a moment of silence, he slowly held her little hand. Whether in my heart or in your eyes, you are the most beautiful. You will never be ugly. Whether in appearance or in heart, you are the most beautiful and the most kind. Aisha looked up at him. Her body slightly shook. She slowly lowered her head and gently leaned her head on Dean's chest. She looked at the clouds and whispered, when I came to the grass giant wall, I guessed that you might find me. I am both afraid and looking forward to it. I can't tell what it is. Since you can't tell, don't think about it. We will always be together, forever. Dean hugged her shoulders. The tip of his nose was touched by her hair. It was a little ticklish, but it was particularly comfortable. We were together for less than 2 years before you became an undead. Dean looked at the blue sea and blue sky in the distance. He only felt that the accumulated depression in his heart was released. His whole person became happy. But in order to find you, I have been looking for you for almost 20 years. Now that I have finally found you, I will never let you leave my sight again. I will never lose you again. Aisha softly nodded and didn't say a word to each other. The Thunderbird slowly flew forward. The more it flew, the farther it flew. Happy Valentine's Day, Acehang mobile phone reading address. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.